Make up mind. Fight.
You know, for a guy who made an entire series about item subcategories in TF2, I've never made it entirely clear what I consider a whole TF2 weapon category to actually be. Basically, I consider a weapon category in TF2 to be any group of weapons that share a unified set of concepts, mechanics, and animations, regardless of what classes they're on. For instance, every rocket launcher and sniper rifle would obviously be a category, in the same way that every backpack, throwable, and set of boots are. It's all about unified designs, equip regions, animations, and concepts. But that's led to a bit of a conundrum, as some TF2 weapons do not share a category with any others. With exception to reskins, let me repeat, with exception to reskins, some TF2 weapons are entirely their own in terms of their concepts and animation sets, and in this video, I want to talk about a few of them. I want to note that the discussion guidelines for this video are incredibly vague and nebulous. Like, do I count things like the beggars, thermal thruster, and shortstop? It was tricky to narrow the discussion down to 4 weapons for this video, so I hope my selection leaves you satisfied. All that said, let's roll.
Don't take it personally when I bullseye an arrow through your skull.
You're gonna try to out-archer me? Good luck with that.
Let's start this video off with one of the hardest weapons I've ever had to talk about for this series. It's an iconic weapon and one of the most subclass facilitating singular tools in the game, yet one that I cannot for the life of me figure out the objective viability and use cases for: the Huntsman. This is such a funny weapon concept, being a simple wooden bow and arrow for sniper. I love the thought of this trained, professional, literal hitman choosing to forego one of the most effective and inconspicuous killing tools on offer in favor of an actual piece of caveman technology. But how effective is it? Let's try and figure it out. The Huntsman is an unlockable primary weapon for the sniper. Rather than being a sniper rifle, it's a simple recurve bow with a wide assortment of unique stats. At a base, it deals less damage than stock, cannot scope, carries less reserve ammo, and most importantly, is subject to being a projectile weapon. This means that unlike the simple hit scan bullets fired by other sniper rifles, the Huntsman shots have to be tracked and led, and are at the mercy of gravity and travel time. As a few positives, this weapon flourishes in close to mid-range combat, its time to reach max charge is significantly shorter than any other sniper rifle, and its projectile hitbox is about the size of East Texas. This allows it to secure incredibly cheeky, borderline random feeling headshots from pretty much any range. It can still insta-drop any class from full health with a fully charged headshot, and makes blind firing it into crowds of enemies totally effective and worth doing. So that was a brief rundown of the Huntsman's stats, but what about its unique mechanics? Well, this weapon is pretty much the projectile older brother to the classic. Rather than simply tap firing, holding mouse 1 will cause the sniper to charge a shot, drawing the arrow back, and releasing mouse 1 will cause him to shoot, with the speed, arc, and damage being proportionate to how long the charge was held. At any point, you can switch weapons or press mouse 2 to cancel a charge, and if you hold mouse 1 for over 5 seconds, the shot will become a misfire and go off in a random direction while also dealing less damage, indicated by the sniper's hands visibly shaking. Additionally, and uniquely for sniper primaries, this weapon can be charged while in midair, enabling some very funny 360 shots. Lastly, friendly pyros can set your arrows on fire, causing them to deal afterburn to enemies struck. Boy, that's a lot of words for some wood. You'd think this was a sleazy romance novel. Regardless, the Huntsman is a unique and interesting weapon because its mere existence completely turns the sniper's intended role and game plan on its head. A class who's typically, and controversially, a potent long-range instant killer, instead becomes a close to mid-range skirmisher with the potential for instant kills without the mobility or bulk of the game's other dedicated close-range fighters. I can genuinely, sincerely not tell you how objectively good or bad this weapon is, because it changes Sniper so much that he basically becomes another class. Not a subclass, but the straight up hidden 10th class. If any dedicated sniper mains want to chime in with a more experienced perspective on this thing and tell me if it's actually really good or really bad, I'd genuinely be interested in hearing how you feel about it. As for its application, the Huntsman flourishes as a weapon that grants the sniper the ability to fight on the front lines. While this might sound a bit useless, as he's not exactly the tankiest or most mobile class, being able to chunk any class for 120 damage or even outright one-shot them can be a surprisingly effective knowledge check on enemies who think you're helpless. Enemies will frequently see a Huntsman sniper as a free kill, and if you're able to line up a shot and put them down, you can handily put them in their place and teach them otherwise. It might seem like a fringe novelty, but you'd be surprised how easily you can rack up kills with this thing when you get in the groove. It's got a bit of an adjustment curve by virtue of being a projectile weapon, but it shouldn't take too long for you to adapt. That said, it is worth noting that the Huntsman is not capable of one-shotting light classes with a body shot. Because of this, this and the lengthy period between fully charged shots, I would always recommend taking an SMG with this weapon. The bonuses afforded by the Girardi and shields don't really combo that well with this weapon's intended playstyle, and the ability to chunk someone for 120 health and then quickly clean them up with a few SMG bullets is really indispensable. With this combo, you can become a shockingly effective light class counter, and you'll often catch scouts, spies, and other pesky flankers completely off guard. Luckily, this is far from the Huntsman's only means of dealing with enemies, as we've ignored a pretty key aspect of this weapon's identity up to this point. The Huntsman is really jank. This thing goes by a wide variety of community nicknames, from the Luxman to the,
Yep, with a capital C.
And the reason for this is because it's entirely, almost unavoidably, easy to rack up completely unearned kills and headshots with this thing. For some reason, its projectile hitbox is fucking gargantuan, as is the area that registers as a headshot on enemies with it, so just blind firing this thing in the general direction of enemies can yield surprising results.
I'm going to blind fire an arrow across the battlement to get an epic frag. What am I telling you?
The amount of times I fired a shot, looked away, and heard that distinct crunchy hit sound effect and seen the kill in the kill feed about a second later is simply absurd. I'd imagine this was Valve's way of compensating for the hypothetically high difficulty of lining up shots without a scope, but just like a soldier with a $4,000 unusual, they may have overcompensated a bit. This also makes the Huntsman a devastating weapon at point blank range. If an enemy is right up in your face, there's not a lot they can do to avoid an instantaneous headshot from any level of charge, simply due to the size of this weapon's projectile hitbox. If you've ever seen Huntsman gameplay on YouTube, you've probably seen the fabled accidental kill, where a player shoots someone they didn't even see or weren't aiming at simply because someone entered their peripheral during a charge. The main thing to keep in mind while using the Huntsman is not getting good or learning the optimal play for it. It's to weaponize the jank. Use the jank, sniper. It's your best friend. This thing is kind of an uncontested weapon in terms of granting hype, oh shit, that killed type of moments in TF2. Ain't nothing quite like throwing out a Hail Mary arrow in a life or death situation and instantly dropping whoever was pestering you. Or on the flip side, sending an arrow across the map and killing someone in a different area code that you're not even sure existed or which class they were playing. This is, at the very least, an extremely fun and novel weapon that definitely brings the laughs. All in all, the Huntsman is a conceptually simple weapon with a bizarre contextual place in the game and an equally bizarre execution. The thought of giving the game's dedicated long-range sniper character a mid-range skirmisher replacement for a sniper rifle is really wild, and something that I'm surprised the game went for, especially as early as 2009. There's a reason that this is one of the most standout and iconic weapons in the game. That said, I also understand why Valve never added another bow with unique stats. Let me repeat, with unique stats to the game, as this one kind of barely functions, and I can't really think of any ways you could iterate on its design outside of simple number adjustments. It's definitely jank, not perfect for every situation, and kind of spits in the face of sniper as a class, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't value the Huntsman's place in TF2. It's a quintessential charming TF2 weapon, and one that I genuinely can't imagine the game without. Until I die to it, then screw this thing.
Hey, Patrick, what am I now?
Stupid?
No, I'm Texas.
What's the difference?
So, you know how the Engineer famously only has 3 unique secondary weapons and only 2 aside from his stock pistol? I'm not gonna lie to you folks, both of his unlockable secondaries are in this video. Somehow, Valve made every option within this class's secondary slot a unique category weapon. Let's start out with the much more iconic and much more reviled one of the two, the Wrangler. The Wrangler needs no introduction. It's simultaneously one of the most ubiquitous and widely hated weapons in TF2. A tool that's infamous for facilitating extremely tanky engineer nests at the cost of virtually nothing to the engineer. Let's discuss the Wrangler. Also, I know there's like a 30-minute deep dive about this weapon with millions of views made by a widely respected professional engineer main YouTuber out there, but let's just ignore that for now. The Wrangler is an unlockable secondary weapon for Engineer. A small satellite dish attached to an Atari controller, this weapon allows the Engineer to take manual control of his sentry gun. What this actually means isn't made entirely clear by the weapon's tooltip, but in essence, using the Wrangler while the Engineer has a sentry up allows the Engineer to control where his usually automated sentry gun aims, being able to aim it and fire at his own discretion. This allows him to effectively pick off key targets, focus potential hazards, and most importantly, pester enemies outside of his sentry's normal range. range. On top of this, the Wrangler comes with a modified aim assist, with the sentry auto-locking its aim onto enemies within the immediate vicinity of the engineer's crosshair. In addition, the Wrangler grants the sentry a shield while it's active, which reduces all incoming damage and repairs by a whopping 66%, giving sentries 2/3 more tankiness at the cost of also giving them 2/3 less healing. And lastly, sentries are disabled for 3 seconds after the Wrangler is taken off of them, even in the event that the engineer dies while having it out. Oh yeah, this thing also increases your sentry gun's firing rate while it's being wrangled for good measure. The blue team had better watch out. This laser pointer has made many hefty promises. For real, the Wrangler might come off as a somewhat innocuous weapon, like taking manual control of your sentry gun might not seem like a huge deal, but rest assured, this thing single-handedly facilitates the entire defensive engineer playstyle, but never for the reason you might think. Also, fun fact, I personally don't really like it. Not just fighting against it, that's obvious, but I also really don't like using the Wrangler. I'm not even trying to be a contrarian or epically set myself apart from Uncle Dane's video YouTuber style. I've just never really liked using this thing. I've always found the Wrangler to be incredibly powerful in its secondary purpose, but kind of clumsy and not very fun in its intended purpose. The shield is inarguably huge, granting the most powerful and effective area denial tool in the game access to what's essentially 2/3 more health is pretty insane, and turns a lot of what are otherwise the sentry gun's biggest counters on their heads. Outside of 8 sticky bombs, there's not a lot that can contend with a wrangled or tanked level 3 sentry. The Herculean effort required by the enemy to output enough damage to kill your sentry is simply not proportionate to the amount of required investment on the engineer's part. When sentries start being able to tank full heavy ubers and direct hit clips, I kind of start raising an eyebrow. The intended negative of the sentry receiving 66% less healing is kind of mitigated by the disproportionate impact of healing versus damage. The enemy team has limited ammo and limited time windows to deal enough damage to a wrangled sentry gun, whereas an engineer with a nearby dispenser has virtually unlimited metal with which to keep healing it, especially with the rescue ranger, or god forbid, a cooperative friendly engineer. Even if it's being done at a significantly weakened rate, an engineer tanking a sentry gun with the Wrangler will be able to output more healing than the enemy can damage off without an extremely coordinated push. And the biggest problem with this is that the engineer doesn't have to do a whole lot. The enemy team might have to spend minutes of a match coordinating a push, building banner and uber, and putting themselves in the perfect position to attack, whereas the engineer just has to have the Wrangler equipped to completely shut them down. This is a fundamentally lopsided imbalance of effort within the game's design, and one that a single unlockable weapon should not be able to passively facilitate. The shield is just a poorly conceived and very overtuned stat that I feel doesn't entirely mesh with this weapon's core or intended design, and as a result can feel pretty damn broken in the right circumstances. Now, back to what I said about not liking using this thing. The shield is obviously strong and the best thing about it, but I'd be lying if I said I particularly enjoyed taking manual control of my sentry gun. To me, it's always seemed a bit too game state and map dependent. In situations where you've only got 1 or 2 areas to focus on, it's incredibly strong, but on map states with a lot of flanks or areas for enemies to attack from, I find that pulling out the Wrangler can often lead to choice anxiety as I try to pinpoint which enemy is most important to target, while also simultaneously making me as the engineer more vulnerable. Without the cover of an auto-aiming death machine, there's not much stopping a particularly aggressive scout or soldier from bombing in on me, thus requiring me to take my attention off of my sentry gun or the enemies I was just fighting to deal with them. On top of that, I've never been able to fully adjust to aiming with the Wrangler. This is totally a me thing, I realize, a total T-Lopal skill issue, but having my crosshair and the origin of my gunfire come from 2 separate sources really disorients me, and I often find myself unable to fully capitalize on powerful Wrangler spots because I just can't adjust in the moment. Again, totally a me thing, but it ultimately results in actually using the Wrangler for fighting enemies to feel exceptionally clumsy, sloppy, and inconsistent to me. Whenever I use it, I often only find myself whipping it out to tank ubers, pester faraway enemies, and rarely jump. This is probably my favorite thing about the Wrangler, the elusive sentry jump. While it's not anywhere near as safe or practical as a rocket or a sticky jump, being able to blast yourself up to a high, unexpected position and rescue ranger your sentry to it is really fun. It enables some absolutely insane sentry spots and in-the-moment plays, and aside from the shield, is the trait that I find the most beneficial about the Wrangler. I know Uncle Dane proposed this in his video, and I'm trying really hard not to just quote that video here, but a dedicated sentry jumper or no self-damage on the Wrangler stat would be really cool. All things considered, the Wrangler is a lopsided weapon that's primary positive is disproportionately situational compared to its much stronger passive secondary abilities. The shield is absolutely ludicrous, and turns it's already one of the deadliest area denial forces in the game into a nigh unkillable wall of damage. By comparison, I find the taking manual control of your sentry stat to be much more situational and difficult to capitalize on, with its best case scenario being a likely unintended bit of movement tech. The Wrangler is an incredibly backloaded weapon that facilitates a ton of plays and tech for the engineer, yet in its rawest state is also his most brain-dead tanking tool. It's a favorite of nobody besides dedicated defensive engineer mains, and is a clear choice for one of TF2's most hated weapons. At least we can play Pitfall with it though.
Nice. Fucking beautiful.
Electronic, supersonic, supersonic, electronic.
The Short Circuit is Engineer's other unlockable secondary for this video, and I know what you might be thinking. Shouldn't it be disqualified for technically sharing animations with the pistol? But joke's on you, dumbass. That's not a pistol. That's a plug. Jokes aside, the Short Circuit is a super unique weapon in TF2 and stands entirely on its own in both concept and design. Also, not unlike the Von Erich family and hit wrestling biopic drama The Iron Claw, this weapon couldn't escape in your constant stream of misfortunes within a comparatively small time frame. This weapon was being significantly changed by Valve in virtually every major TF2 update right up until they stopped balancing the game, and as a result, its current version bears almost no gameplay resemblance to its original iteration. But just what is the Short Circuit, and is it any good in spite of all that? Let's find out. The Short Circuit is an unlockable secondary weapon for Engineer, a strange plug-like apparatus that replaces the Engineer's right arm. This weapon's primary fire shoots out a small burst of electrical energy that deals 10 damage to enemies immediately in front of the Engineer, and consumes 5 of its metal as ammo. As an alternative choice, pressing right-click with this weapon consumes 65 metal to blast a slow-moving ball of electrical energy that cannot be stopped save for obstacles and being reflected, deals 15 damage every half second to anyone in its path, and most importantly, deletes any projectiles it crosses paths with. As a few trade-offs, this weapon cannot crit under any circumstances, deals pitiful damage to buildings, and uses the Engineer's metal reserve for its ammo. So, full disclosure, this weapon's primary attack is virtually useless, and I don't think I recorded more than 2 or 3 clips of me using it. It's an incredibly short-range, narrow, pitifully weak little zapper that has no application outside of being a literal mosquito to enemies. I've heard some people propose removing the primary attack altogether, but I'm not a huge fan of this idea, as I think it would give new players a much worse understanding of this weapon's intended purpose and the uses of its much more important alternative attack. If this thing was on Mouse 1, you know that every little Timmy you found it through random drop would be spamming it. As for that alternative attack, it's the main thing you want to be doing with this weapon. It's such a bizarre concept, being this huge anime-esque full power energy ball that travels in an unstoppable path for a few seconds before bursting. I'd make the Mega Man joke, but I already did. As for the applications of the energy ball, they're actually pretty layered. For one, the ball passes through enemies and can't be stopped by anything but walls, map objects, and being reflected before bursting, and it deals damage to anyone caught in its path at a rate of 15 damage every half second, so while a single tick isn't that amazing, if you manage to line this thing up in the path of a fleeing enemy or group of enemies, or use it as a gap closer, then you can really soften people up for eventual kills. In addition, the ball's primary application is deleting projectiles. This might seem like it's transparently designed to help your sentry survive, as you can delete a wave of spam as it comes your way to destroy your nest, but in actuality, this is pretty damn wasteful, as you're not preventing too much damage you couldn't more easily and cheaply heal off by just tanking your gun with your wrench, and the cost of 65 metal per ball makes this strategy all around not great. No, I found that the actual best case scenario for the Short Circuit is as an incredibly aggressive, team-oriented pushing tool. If you're situated on a cart where you're granted infinite metal at the rate of a small dispenser, there is nothing stopping you from throwing out ball after ball at no cost. This makes the usual strategies of spamming contested points and carts with projectiles and explosives pretty damn ineffective, as you have a constant wave of delete beams flying in every direction for the enemies trying to stop you. You can be a very effective shield for your team with this thing, preventing damage and cleaning up projectiles so long as you have metal to spare. It's a bit harder on non-payload maps as you don't have a constant stream of metal, but even then, with conservative and patient use of the energy ball and backing support of your team, ammo packs from defeated players shouldn't be too hard to come by. On top of that, this weapon significantly levels the playing field between engineer and projectile classes in fights. What's usually an easy 2-rocket stomp for an enemy soldier becomes a much trickier, more mind game heavy duel, as both players assess their options and wait for the right opportunities to strike. This might sound familiar, as it's basically the Soldier v Pyro matchup. It's also very funny to delete a soldier's rocket as he jumps to make him crater. I've been talking about Soldier a lot so far, but this weapon also crushes Demo Man. A single energy ball can delete an entire sticky trap in one fell swoop, and a spam happy demo will quickly find his strategy crumbling in the the face of the delete ball menacingly floating towards him.
What could be worse than a giant bubble?
Oh, I know. 2 giant bubbles.
This weapon effectively turns engineers' typical hard counters on their heads, but in a much more interesting and skill-intensive way than the Wrangler. One last application I want to note for this weapon is probably its most commonly known one, which is its unique utility at clearing spawn gates at the start of rounds. If you know, you know. Dust Bowl first matches were never the same after 2018. Being able to spam out energy balls and erase all manner of crit-boosted pipes and rockets while also clearing sticky traps is very funny when you do it right, and infuriating when it happens to you. This is definitely a less universal use case and depends heavily on the map and game state, but is still a use case nonetheless. Now, I just said a lot of positive things about the short circuit, but rest assured, this thing is not Engineer's best secondary, and it does have quite a few concrete bits of counterplay and negatives that keep it in check. For one, bullets completely shut it down. Against a heavy scout, sniper, or enemy engineer, your energy ball is nothing but a brightly colored distraction that means them no bother. Same for fire. They can still kill you all the same. On top of that, the 65 metal per ball cost is very pricey, and means that any observant enemy can very easily gauge when you've expended your entire supply after 3 shots and attack accordingly. This weapon mandates extremely patient, careful use of its energy balls, and just randomly chucking them out there as soon as you leave spawn will mean swiftly running out. All said and done, the short circuit is a very cool, very thought-intensive weapon that really livens up some of Engineer's more problem aspects as a class. Its use cases might be a bit more specialized in the much more flexible pistol and much more universally useful Wrangler, but in the right hands and game state, this is a frighteningly potent tool that can allow Engineer to go one-on-one with some of his most dangerous hard counters. It's not a must-equip, but it's far from a gimmicky novelty and can absolutely put work in. Also, I'm sorry I called you a dumbass earlier. Unless you're a soldier or demo main who's mad at me for this section, in which case I'm absolutely not sorry.
Charge your gun! Oh, right!
Our last weapon for this video is the Righteous Bison, and I'll be brutally honest, I do not understand or like this weapon one bit. I've already covered its tumultuous update history in my Weapons Valve Actively Hates video, but for a brief synopsis, Valve seems to really despise it, hitting it with a steady stream of potent nerfs throughout the years and passing these changes off as bug fixes, despite the game itself actively stating that they weren't intended mechanics. This weapon was almost always viewed as a funny novelty and not a serious contender within the game's highest levels of play, so Valve's explicitly targeted nerf campaign against it was puzzling to say the least. But where does that leave it now? Let's try and figure it out. The Righteous Bison is an unlockable weapon for the soldier. A small, retro-futuristic ray gun with a pumping mechanism, it fires a slow-moving projectile that cannot be reflected under any circumstances, passes through enemies, and hypothetically has no limits in the number of times it can hit a single player. On top of this, the Righteous Bison doesn't require ammo save for needing to reload after 4 shots, giving it an infinite ammo reserve. As a few trade-offs, this weapon deals pitiful per tick damage, it deals even less damage to buildings, and its projectile is incredibly slow, disjointed, buggy, and difficult to line up. All of this might sound pretty reminiscent of the Short Circuit's alternate attack, firing a slow-moving projectile that passes through enemies and hits multiple times, but whereas the Short Circuit fired a large, linear energy ball that organically passed through targets and effectively dealt multiple ticks of damage within its radius, the Righteous Bison does none of that. I'll put it plainly, this weapon is absolutely fucking terrible, and I have no idea what its intended use case or best application is. I know it has its fans, I know it has its truthers, and I know it has people who swear by it, but from my experience, everything, let me repeat, everything this weapon does is done better by other options in the soldier's lineup. For the life of me, I cannot figure out why you would ever equip it or pull it out in a fight. For starters, the damage is both startlingly inconsistent and very low at the same time. I swear, from any range, I was unable to connect more than 1 or 2 ticks on any given enemy, and the plotting pace and small size of the projectile made it borderline impossible for it to effectively rack up damage in the same way as the Short Circuit. I actually don't understand the intended design or vision for this thing, since Valve claims that its base damage is 20 and that it's unlimited in the amount of times it could hit an enemy, but I was hitting for anywhere from 20 to a maximum of 48 damage every time I fired it, with seemingly no rhyme or reason as to how much damage each shot would do. On top of that, the projectile is alarmingly slow and borderline impossible to line up beyond close range. It has an insanely lengthy wind-up period after you've actually pressed mouse 1 before the projectile actually comes out, and by that point, it's committed to a straight arc that the enemy can easily dodge. I know know everyone got mad at me for my Bison aim and my weapons Valve actively hates video, but rest assured, this is the experience of using the Bison. The only time shots are at all easy to consistently land is at point blank range or in choke points, and at that point, you're dealing more damage by hitting enemies with your melee or your rocket launcher. The unlimited ammo doesn't really matter when you're not able to connect any of your 4 shots, and even if you do, the reward is a paltry 20 to 50 damage from any range. This is the biggest problem with the Righteous Bison. There is no reason to equip it over other soldier options. Anything that the Righteous Bison does is done better and more consistently by soldiers' other secondaries. An unreflectable close-range pyro counter, shotgun, a combo tool, a reserve shooter, a trapping tool. You have a fucking rocket launcher that does splash damage. The Righteous Bison offers nothing outside of funny memes and quote-unquote styling on your enemies, and I don't know about y'all, but I generally prefer weapons that I can actually use over haha funnies. I dislike Fat Scout for the same reason. I'm not a big fan of handicapping myself for the funny. If a weapon's bad but also fun to use, I'll absolutely give it a try, but this weapon is neither fun nor funny from my experience. It's just very bad and very frustrating. I fully realize that the Bison does have fans and is a popular weapon in spite of its issues, but for me, I just can't rationalize using it. Valve's targeted nerfs against it, combined with its already lackluster damage and jank, results in a weapon that feels borderline unusable, and anytime I whip it out in a fight, I often feel as though I'm either actively handicapping myself or straight up throwing. Why would I not just shoot enemies with my rocket launcher? Why would I not just bring a banner or a shotgun? I understand that games are supposed to be fun and that you can't be a meta slave or always play optimally, but considering that I find the Bison to be neither fun or optimal, I think I can personally go without it. All in all, the Righteous Bison is a bad weapon. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. I've heard people propose a lot of potential use cases for it, from a trapping tool to a follow-up tool, but from my experience, the juice is never worth the squeeze of this weapon. I don't find any ironic meme enjoyment in it like I would with something like the Ullapool Caber. It's just an all-around anti-fun throw weapon and a possible contender for my least favorite weapon in the game. I apologize that this video turned into a stealth bombing assassination mission against the Righteous Bison. I promise my next video will be more positive all around. But if you like it, more power to you. Never let some dumb shit casual YouTuber tell you what weapons to enjoy. I may dislike it, but this weapon can still be righteous to you. And that's a few wholly unique TF2 weapons. Weapons that don't share their categories or mechanics with any other weapons in the game. Between the Wrangler and Short Circuit being great, the Huntsman being gimmicky if fun, and the Righteous Bison being that, I think it's safe to say that these weapons stand comfortably on their own within TF2's lineup of weapons, even in spite of their unique stats. I honestly kind of love that TF2 is such a varied game in terms of its weapon design. The Valve could go out of their way to design a bunch of unique mechanics and animation sets for a few singular items. It really goes to show how unique and one of a kind this game is, or at least was, and I for one welcome anything that makes this already one of a kind game stand out even more. Even if I'm not a huge fan of the Righteous Bison, I would never want it removed. Thanks, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!